If you've been following my channel for a while or have spent any sort of time in or around members of the UK trans community, a name you've likely heard people mention is Rosa Dawn. She's a trans woman / YouTuber who clearly seeks to assert herself as the UK's answer to Blair White, lying about other trans people in an attempt to be accepted by the British far right. And there's very little Dawn won't do to achieve said dream, even going so far as to help clean up after sexual predators and other abusers, as we'll discuss in a second. Though before we can get round to doing that, I of course need to give a content warning for the following topics: sexual assault, transphobia, ableism, discussion on suicide, self-harm, and domestic abuse. If you like our work and appreciate the research put into each video, please consider supporting the channel via Patreon. You can also support us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media. Hi there, my name's Ethel Thurston, and we're here to talk about Rosa Dawn and the way in which she tried to hide gender-critical icon Lily Cade's history as a serial rapist. I know this video took a while to come out with everything happening last November, but I'm of the opinion that when it comes to people defending serial rapists, there really isn't an expiry date, though maybe Dawn disagrees. So, as already mentioned, Rosa Dawn is someone who has built a career by lying about the trans community in order to bolster the broad narratives used by the far right as justification for the violence targeted at us. We've actually covered a number of her lies regarding the Bell v Tavistock case last year, during which we found no less than 12 distinct lies, as well as 3 notable lies by omission, all of which feed the narrative that cis children are being forced to believe that they're transgender. Dawn is so wrapped up in selling her audience this narrative that she openly celebrated when the High Court of England and Wales ruled the age of full medical consent for trans folk was not 16 like it is for the rest of the UK, but 18. Thankfully, said violation of human rights was overturned, but Dawn's reaction is a clear demonstration of the degree of abject cruelty she's willing to support in order to further her ideology, that she sees consenting adults being denied the human right to consent to life-saving medical treatment and cheer. And yet, this is by no means her only narrative. Oh no. Another thing that Rosa Dawn likes to do is spin the yarn that the vast majority of trans women, herself excluded of course, are sexual predators. So it came as little surprise to discover that she'd make an appearance in the BBC's article which pretended like there was a concerted effort by trans women to rape cis lesbians. Now, myself and Levi have already done a fully referenced 3-hour stream going over some of the many issues relating to the article and its sources, and that is definitely worth the watch if you have the time, as it will give you a lot more context. However, another thing we talked about specifically was the fact that the BBC knowingly presented a self-confessed serial rapist as one of its primary sources. Allow me to repeat myself in case you missed it. The editors at the BBC had prior knowledge that Lily Cade, the author's primary source strawmanning the cotton ceiling, had publicly admitted to raping at least 3 different women. That's why, when the BBC updated the article following Ms. Cade's later actions, more on those in a second, they stated, quote, "We have updated this article, published last week, to remove a contribution from one individual in light of comments she has published on blog posts in recent days, which we have been able to verify. We acknowledge that an admission of inappropriate behaviour by the same contributor should have been included in the original article." End quote. Lily Cade is a self-confessed serial rapist, having admitted to raping Jasmine Summers, Honey Gold, and Marin by name in 2017, not disputing events which the victims themselves described as rape. Of course, as is typical of rape culture, Ms. Cade does so whilst continually downplaying the extent of the horror of her actions through her use of language. Ms. Cade refers to said rape as her, quote, "usual hijinks," end quote, stating that it, quote, "was my thing," end quote. Another euphemism can be seen when she states that, quote, "some girls didn't appreciate the bathroom trips," end quote. That's Lily Cade pretending as if being raped by her was a minor inconvenience. But perhaps the most terrifying fact is the way in which Ms. Cade ends her apology. Because in spite of telling us, quote, "I thought that the girls went along with me because they enjoyed it, but they did it because they felt they couldn't say no," end quote, demonstrating that she very clearly understands the power dynamics at play here, Ms. Cade ends her apology by telling her victims to contact her in private. If you've ever spent any time around abuse situations, you know that this is not something an abuser should ever do, as it means they have every intention of manipulating their victims. All this was then rebranded by the BBC as an admission of inappropriate behaviour, with the BBC then going on to tell us, whilst they wish they decided to include a mention of Miss Cade being a self-confessed serial rapist, they would have presented her as an authority on women's safety anyway. It's only when Lily called for the execution of every single trans woman, going so far as to even call for the immediate lynchings of several high-profile trans women by name, that the BBC draws the line. But even then, they refuse to refer to her actions as anything more than comments she has published on blog posts in recent days. Now, it's questionable as to whether they removed Lily Cade due to her cause of genocide making the BBC look bad, or if they did so due to the fact that she mentioned a handful of trans women by name, some of whom have the finances to potentially hold the BBC accountable for promoting Ms. Cade. What's not in question is the fact that Ms. Cade was very clearly emboldened by her newfound position of authority, handed to her on a silver platter by the BBC, so much in fact that she went ahead and tagged the BBC itself when she posted her gender-critical manifesto to Twitter. Either way, there is no reason to believe the BBC did what it did out of the goodness of their hearts. They were looking out for themselves, which is something Rosa Dawn has also gone on to do, bringing us rather nicely to the way in which Rosa Dawn lied to defend a known serial rapist. As the revelation surrounding Lily Cade being a serial rapist began to dominate the conversation, I couldn't help but notice that Rosa Dawn was pretending as if this weren't the case. She continued to promote the article, acting as if the only reason people were criticizing it was because it disagreed with them, not the shitty methodology and, the fact that it promoted a serial rapist as an authority on women's safety. It was so noticeable that I included a mention of Dawn in the script of the video that eventually turned into the livestream, as can be seen in these dated edits. However, with the publishing of Lily Cade's gender-critical manifesto, that had to change. Dawn could no longer rely on simply pretending like there wasn't an issue with the inclusion of a serial rapist as a gold star witness in an article pretending to care about the safety of women. She was going to have to address the issue in a way that didn't highlight the facts that she promoted a serial rapist for days. Here's what Dawn came up with. Quote, "The following two statements can be true at the same time. Lily Cade is unhinged, has called for the deaths of trans women, and has also faced accusations of sexual assault. Some lesbians have faced pressure to date trans women under the threat of being labelled bigots." Just putting this out there because Lily Cade's repulsive tirade will be used to discredit the recent BBC article, which caused quite a stir, and I predict it will be taken down on that basis. End quote. So much to unpack here. Starting of course with the way in which Ms. Dawn is lying to her audience about the extent of Lily Cade's sexual violence. There is absolutely no way in hell that Dawn didn't know about Cade's confession, especially since everyone talking about the issue at the time was passing around a direct link to said confession. She simply opted to pretend like it doesn't exist, to downplay just how horrific her own actions have been in ignoring the issue for almost a week after it became general knowledge. It's also worth noting that, when Dawn asserts that Ms. Cade had faced accusations of sexual assault, she's implying that A. said claims have never been verified, let alone confessed to by Cade herself, and that B. they're no longer relevant, having faded away. She is lying to protect a known predator, thus protecting herself due to her own involvement in presenting this person as an authority on women's safety, long after it was made clear to Dawn that she was a self-confessed serial rapist. But it gets worse, because Dawn has chosen to use a passive voice, specifically agentless passive, a style of writing in which the people behind an action, in this case Jasmine Summers, Honey Gold, and Marin coming forward about Ms. Cade's history of sexual violence, are left out of the sentence. This forces the reader to center Ms. Cade while simultaneously othering her victims as some faceless force, making people less likely to connect with Ms. Cade's victims and more likely to assume innocence on Ms. Cade's behalf. Add to this the previous issues and the cultural myth of rampant false allegations, and it's clear that Dawn is framing Cade as if she were the real victim, in spite of her confession. And this is carried over to the section in which Dawn acts like the article on women's safety being brought into question over the fact that its sole named first-hand account is a self-confessed serial rapist of women is the real crime here, and the fact that the BBC chose to include her doesn't actually mean anything. That is very clearly bullshit, and it kinda shocks me that I had to explain this, but for any of the Dawns out there listening to this, no self-respecting team would knowingly run an article presenting a person who has publicly confessed to being a serial rapist as an authority on women's safety, not unless they were truly desperate. Hell, returning to what I mentioned earlier, the BBC even stated in no uncertain terms that they would have rather published the article acknowledging the facts that Ms. Cade is a serial rapist than cut her part out. Again, the only reason they cut it out was because they faced massive backlash and potential lawsuit over Ms. Cade calling for the murder of some rather wealthy people. And yet, returning to the fact that the BBC would still choose to include Lily Cade even if they were forced to disclose her history as a serial rapist, Dawn seems to agree, going on to state the following after she had made the post discussed at the start of the section, adding that, quote, "Is it okay if I point out that Lily Cade's pro-genocide blog post was written more than a week after the BBC article was published? Like, they don't have a time machine to hand, so they couldn't have checked it out prior to publication." End quote. So not only was it the biggest topic of conversation across the board in trans circles at the time, but by this point the fucking BBC had publicly acknowledged the fact that they knew Ms. Cade was a self-confessed serial rapist prior to publishing. And yet, here is Dawn, pretending as if the only possible reason not to include her was the fact that she wrote the gender-critical manifesto a week later. I've gotta say, in spite of knowing exactly what she's about, Rosa Dawn somehow never ceases to amaze me in just how low she will stoop to hurt other trans people, just how disgusting of a person she really is, that she'll cover up for a serial rapist in this way. Like, I thought as gone as she was, surely there must be some semblance of conscience left inside her head, some inkling of what is right. Turns out, I was wrong. Rosa Dawn doesn't care about victims of rape and abuse. In fact, she seems to hold a special degree of disdain towards them. The only time she's willing to pretend to give a shit is when she feels she can use said victim's trauma to paint all other trans people as evil and line her own pockets. What's more is, even ignoring the rape, which is an absolutely ghoulish thing to have to say, the BBC didn't need a time machine to predict what would happen. Why? Nothing Lily Cade said in her manifesto was out of the norm for the gender-critical crowd. Every argument made in that article, every claim, every call to action was something prominent figures in the gender-critical ideology had already stated, repeatedly. Every single one. So contrary to what people like Dawn would have you believe, this wasn't bigotry motivated by mental illness, this was bigotry motivated by the very same ideology Rose of Dawn is selling her audience every single day. In fact, Lily Cade even used one of Rosa Dawn's signature moves, something that might explain why Dawn is so scared of people linking things to her. So let's talk about that. So as I was initially reading Lily Cade's Gender Critical Manifesto, there was a particular section that stuck out to me as very familiar. That section was, of course, the following. Quote, "They threatened suicide and you rolled over. You disgust me too. There is but one noble response to a man who tries to use the threat of violence against himself to manipulate a woman's emotions. Fucking do it then." End quote. Now, where have I heard this argument before? Oh wait, I remember.
And then you have some of the really bizarre takes that came from the trans community as a result of all this. You had mermaids pointing out that you have to do this, otherwise plenty of trans kids are going to kill themselves, which, you know, is really like an abuser. That's an abuser's narrative there.
First things first, it's not an abuser's narrative. An abuser weaponizes the threat of self-harm or suicide as a means of limiting the autonomy of their victim to deny said victim control over their life. The abuser threatens to harm or kill themselves should their victim ever do something to displease them, such as leaving them or speaking out about their abuse, manipulating the abuser's victim into believing that it'd be the victim who would be responsible, thereby forcing the victim to sacrifice themselves to appease their abuser. That is the complete opposite of what the trans community is doing. The trans community is defending the autonomy of its members from those who would seek to strip it away. Nobody is having their autonomy limited by upholding the right to self-identify and the right to both medical and bodily autonomy. Because, spoiler, your right to be a shitty human being and enforce your gender-critical ideology on others ends the very moment we are talking about the rights of someone else. As the expression goes, your right to swing your fist ends the moment it makes contact with my face. On this specific level, what's being done here by people such as Lily Cade and Rosa Dawn is similar to someone arguing that cis women going on hunger strike in order to push for safe and legal abortions is equivalent to the hypothetical of cis men going on hunger strike to push for the outlawing of abortion. Both actions are identical on a physical level, but the context of who is limiting whose autonomy, that power dynamic that is at play here, makes the two instances very different. On top of this, we have to keep in mind the fact that the power dynamics of an intimate personal relationship can't really be compared to the social and political interactions between different demographics. Like, even if every cis man in the US were to threaten suicide if abortion weren't outlawed, yes, it would be horrific and violent towards people who need abortion access, it would not be domestic abuse. Fact is, trans folk, particularly trans youth, are not turning to suicide as a political act. It's something that is happening due to how bleak the current situation is, a fact that researchers have uncovered and we're fighting to prevent. So this argument really is an absolute mess. Dawn has watered down the concept of weaponizing self-harm and suicide to the point that a victim of domestic abuse who attempted to take their own life out of desperation would be the true abuser in her eyes, whether or not they ever intended for anyone to find out their reasons, which is indicative of both Dawn and Lily's approach towards trans people in general, falling back on a method known as DARVO. That is, deny wrongdoing, attack the accuser, and reverse victim and offender. The whole reason Ms. Cade was in that story to begin with was due to the fact that, after agreeing to do a scene with fellow porn star Ms. Devine, Ms. Cade discovered that she was trans and withdrew. Ms. Devine respected Ms. Cade's wishes, going away and doing her own thing, never contacting Ms. Cade again as far as I'm aware. Though Ms. Cade was criticised by, in her own words, quote, very fringe queer porno people, end quote, not over her choice, but how she went about things. One only has to read how she described Ms. Devine's genitals in the BBC article all these years later to get an idea of what I mean, with Ms. Cade stating, quote, I couldn't see past the facts that what I was interacting with was male genitalia altered by surgery and not the reproductive organ of a female ape, and I just couldn't get past that." End quote. It's important to note that Ms. Cade had already seen photos of Ms. Devine's genitals prior to agreeing to do a scene and was seemingly excited at the prospect, so the appearance of the genitals is not the issue. It was only after she discovered that Ms. Devine was trans and had undergone gender reassignment that her perspective changed. A while later, Ms. Devine began to work alongside Planned Parenthood to do a workshop on the cotton ceiling, a term that discusses how prejudicial narratives surrounding trans people impact both dating and sex work. In spite of the fact that Ms. Cade was never mentioned, she went out of her way to make Ms. Devine's talk about their prior interaction, denying having done anything wrong. She then went on to attack Ms. Devine's work as predatory before finally reversing victim and offender, with Ms. Cade presenting herself as the victim of sexual coercion. What's especially horrific about this is how Ms. Cade directly exploits her being ostracized over being a confessed serial rapist, presenting that as evidence to validate her claims that there's some effort to force her to sleep with trans women. All throughout her gender-critical manifesto, she talks about herself being dead, a metaphor for a faltering porn work. However, when you actually go back and look at things, you begin to realize that Ms. Cade's career began to suffer not as a result of Ms. Devine's work, but as a result of multiple women in the industry speaking out about her history of sexual violence, taking the proactive stance to warn newer members to the industry. Yet Cade seems to have taken the facts that she was Me Too'd and decided that no, her being a rapist isn't the real problem. It's the trans people who are to blame and deserve to be murdered, which is another thing she shares with other gender-critical people, such as Kelly J. Keane.
Had a bit of an idea about some of the things that you can do, and men, for once, I'm talking to you. I'm talking about you dads who maybe carry, I think that's what you say, I'm so down with the American lingo, maybe you carry, maybe you don't. Maybe you consider yourself a protector of women. Maybe you're that sort of man. Maybe you have a daughter or a mother or a wife. Maybe you have a sister. Maybe you just have some friends. Maybe you just think women are human and you don't need any absolute connection with them to feel compelled to protect us. I think you should start using women's toilets, men, because you have every right to self-identify. Clearly don't do it and upset women and girls that are already in there, but just make a point of doing it and maybe make the women feel okay about you doing it if you come out and you frighten someone. But it's about time that you started using women's toilets and saying that you identify as a woman if stopped. And I think that's how you're going to that's one of the many ways that you are going to have to combat the insanity of self-ID. Even if it's not called self-ID, that's pretty much what you have now in the United States. And that's how you men are going to help. And there's going to be no excuses. And you either care about the women and girls in your life or you don't. But you are going to start inserting yourselves into spaces that are specifically for women and girls. Maybe you're going to do it when you go to your kids' school and they've had to inject this federal nonsense of accepting boys into girls' spaces. Maybe you need to make a point of saying to the head teacher that you're going to go and use the toilet and ask where the girls' toilets are. And you're going to make this really embarrassing for everybody who's going along with it. I'm talking about you dads who maybe carry, I think that's what you say. I'm so down with the American lingo. Maybe you carry, maybe you don't.
Again, what Ms. Cade wrote is nothing shocking or out of the norm for members of the gender-critical ideology, such as Rose of Dawn or Ms. Keane. Everything in her gender-critical manifesto is stolen from other members of her ideology. She didn't even say the quiet part out loud, as some people have stated. Her real crime, at least in the eyes of her peers like Dawn, is bringing their collective works under one roof. Because as isolated statements, there are instances that people like Ms. Dawn and Ms. Keane can easily handwave, but the moment they reach a critical mass, That breaks down the visage of civility that the gender-critical ideology has spent so much time and effort fighting for. That's why Dawn is trying to put some distance between herself and Ms. Cade, not because she's a serial rapist, but because she's someone who endangered the central lie that Dawn has built her entire career on. However, there's even more to this story. You see, I know of a second case that proves Rosa Dawn is absolutely fine with abusers weaponizing self-harm and suicide to silence criticism and will even set out to help them do so. Because Lily Cade is not the first abuser Rosa Dawn has supported on her channel, a fact that's worth delving into. Because those of you who have already seen my previous response to Rosa Dawn, which included a quick refutation of the abuser narrative claim, might recall me stating the following as my video neared the 1 hour mark. Now, not only is this something I've been accused of in my line of work, it's something I've been accused of by someone who actually went ahead and did just that. They used self-harm to silence criticism. But what's really interesting about that case is the fact that Rosa Dawn openly supported them. Now I have a lot more to say on that, far too much to fit in this video, and maybe I'll do a full video doing just that in future, but I just wanted to give a quick refutation for now. Well, today is the future and I always keep my word. It might take me a whole year, hell it might even take me 3, but I do get around to things eventually. Let's talk about Rosa Dawn's support for serial transphobe, Rachel Oates. But first, some background. Note that I'll be condensing a lot of stuff here. I've got around 6 months of material to cover in just a few minutes, so if I ever state something you'd like expanded on, please check the reference list in the video transcript. So this whole shit show started due to the transphobia of popular secular YouTuber Stephen Woodford, more commonly known as Rationality Rules. He's someone who has stated he agreed with Ben Shapiro on the topic of trans people, he animated an attack helicopter meme while thanking Jordan Peterson for his defense of biological fact, and had just gone on to attack trans women in sports using pseudoscience. Woodford was of course called out on this, leading him to play the victim, literally comparing himself to frigging Galileo, as the whole thing broke down into a reactionary shit show. Now, 2 of Woodford's close friends at the time were Rachel Oates, as you might have guessed, and another YouTuber called Thomas Westbrook, username Holy Kool-Aid. Both of them were running point for Woodford, with Oates desperately trying to cover for his transphobic history and Westbrook attacking anyone who dared be the slightest bit critical of him. I remember when I blocked Oates back in May, Westbrook was incredibly aggressive in trying to force me to unblock her when I could see exactly what she was trying to do the very moment she entered the discussion. He also went on to lead a McCarthy-style coup of the atheist community of Austin, demanding to know if candidates did or had ever supported the ACA's prior statement of solidarity with the LGBT+ community, attacking anyone who did, whilst also claiming not to be a bigot, as they always do. Sadly for him, one of his sponsors, Jonathan Friedel, aka the Chief Nerd, wasn't exactly making things easy for him. Friedel was not only a self-admitted transphobe, but was someone who harassed me to the degree that even Westbrook couldn't defend his behaviour. Instead, he began spinning this yarn that said abuse was part of some secret job interview, and that I should feel thankful for the abuse. It was at this point that Golas Cranium asked him about whether Friedel was one of Westbrook's sponsors, only for Westbrook to bite his head off whilst refusing to answer. Only problem for Thomas, however, is the fact that Friedel's donations are listed at the end of every one of his videos between March 2018 and May 2019, amounting to at least $350 US. My response, however, came in 2 parts. First, abuse is not part of my job description. I think it's horrific that anytime a marginalized person in the public eye is abused, there are always sick fucks like Westbrook who claim that the abuse is an essential part of the job. It isn't. Second, they were lucky they targeted me since I had a support structure in place, meaning I was at no risk of self-harm or suicide. But I warned them that if they continue to target other trans people in the manner they had me, they would eventually kill someone. And just so there's absolutely no confusion here, I stated I was not at risk of self-harm and suicide repeatedly. My warning was about other members of the trans community. Well, Rachel Oates had something to say about that, as can be seen in this video posted by her on the 25th of August 2019.
I spoke about it in my live stream the other night, but a certain YouTuber who we all know spread some lies about me recently released a video in which they said, basically, you're criticizing me for this and this. It's a good job I don't self-harm anymore. And then basically went on to say or imply, if people keep criticizing me for this and this, who knows what I'll do? I might hurt myself again. I don't want to get into the details, but this is an issue that is incredibly, incredibly personal to me. And I found his words disgusting. You never, ever, ever use something like self-harm to threaten other people. When you have that problem, that's your problem. And you cannot threaten other people with it. You cannot say, well, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't treat me like a normal person, because I'll hurt myself because of you. That's manipulative and disgusting, and it trivializes the whole issue of self-harming in the first place. And I found it completely disgusting. It is not okay. And of course, it completely, detracts from the issue that I know for a fact there is someone who, as a result of that YouTuber's behavior, has self-harmed. Not naming names, not pointing fingers anywhere, but I know for a fact that has happened. Why is that only an issue when it's a trans person self-harming? Because that's what the YouTuber seems to think. Anyway, sorry, getting off point. Really annoyed me. It's disgusting behavior. My point is, you never, ever, ever try and control someone's behavior by threatening violence against them or yourself. It is not okay, and it is never, ever acceptable. This is something I feel really, really strongly about.
Reminder, the level of abuse Rachel Oates is labeling criticism was so bad that not even Westbrook, someone who turned up with a mob at the ACA elections to physically intimidate its members, not even he felt comfortable downplaying. Instead, he had to come up with this cock and bull lie about Friedel being some sort of undercover boss. That really is demonstrative of just how blatantly Oates lies to her audience, which is why she never references anything like I do. Because she'd be caught out. Speaking of referencing, I've gone ahead and included a timestamped link to the stream Oates mentioned in which she goes on a 27-minute rant about me, that time mentioning me by name so you can confirm that she is talking about me for yourself. It's also worth mentioning that she published the video I just played you the clip from on the 25th of August, the week before she went on to state publicly that she'd left me alone for 3 months. 1 week, 3 months, they're practically the same thing. But the main takeaway, the main thing I want you to keep in mind with all of this is not only the fact that Rachel Oates was doing the same thing as Lily Cade and Rosa Dawn, presenting warnings about the harm that transphobia causes our community as an abuser's narrative, but the fact that weaponizing suicide and self-harm was at the very front of her mind. Why? Well, because on the 4th of September 2019, Rachel Oates would go on to weaponize self-harm as a means of silencing her critics. Though, to understand things better, we have to go back a couple of days to the 2nd of September, during which I unblocked Oates and responded to her lies defending Rationality Rules' continued transphobia, posting a total of 2 tweets. As you might be able to guess, I was quickly set upon by Oates' transphobic audience and realised that this had been a bad move, leading me to reblock her. Yet the conversation continued without her for the next 2 days, during which I told a white person in Africa to leave Woodford's Church of Transphobia, a comment that was later clipped and presented without context to make it appear like I told said person to commit suicide. I published a clarification, apologised to the couple of people who appeared genuinely hurt by the proliferation of said clipped quote, regardless of my intent, and that was it. Those people accepted my apology and moved on. Rachel Oates, however, was not about to let this go. She called on her 100,000 subscribers to circumvent my block of her, mentioning said block in her post, effectively ordering them to abuse me into apologizing to her for having ever pointed out her history of transphobia, using the excuse about a tweet sent to someone else whilst I had her blocked as justification. In response, I posted a thread to my own wall detailing how many of her actions were transphobic, why I would never apologize for pointing them out, and most importantly, how she could begin to fix things with the trans community. A post which is still up, and I certainly suggest reading to make up your own mind about what happened next. For you see, because of that last bit, me describing how Rachel Oates could fix things, that made me too dangerous to be allowed to continue to talk, at least in her mind. She just ordered her fans to swarm my page, and I'd gone right ahead and pinned said thread to it, meaning they were going to see that I'm not some unreasonable zealot criticizing without solutions. They see that everything she'd ever told them about me was a lie and nothing more. Rachel Oates realized that she needed to shut me down, and she needed to do so fast. Within a couple of hours, Rachel Oates had recorded, edited, and uploaded a video in which she displayed signs of self-harming. She claimed I'd been stalking her, in spite of all the evidence showing that I'd had her blocked for months while she continued to target me. I mean, only one of us was making 27-minute rants and following them up with a published video the week before all this happened. I had my moment of weakness and clapped back at her with 2 tweets, but they're still up there, fully visible, since I have nothing to hide. Sadly, reason meant very little to our audience who were being whipped up into a bigoted fury. Do you remember that tweet responding to the white African telling them to leave Woodford's Church of Transphobia? Well, not only was it clipped to make it seem like I told said white African to commit suicide, all of a sudden said clipped tweet was me telling Rachel Oates, a British person, someone on a completely different continent, to commit suicide. That's how void of reasoning these accusations were, and I am still getting comments about this years later. The violence was immediate. Rachel Oates had weaponized not just self-harm, but trans-misogyny and benevolent patriarchy, leveraging them to get others to enact violence on her behalf. Reminder that Oates' friend Woodford had spent the past 6 months presenting trans women and AMAB trans femme folk as inherently dangerous to cis women, meaning they were largely conditioned to accept her accusations without merit. And once they did that, all they saw was the poor upper-class white woman targeted by the evil and conniving trans femme person who they needed to protect her from. I was presumed guilty on the basis of who I am, what I am, all because I had the audacity to criticize an upper-class white woman for her transphobia, telling her how she could fix things if she actually wanted to. The cost of which, on a personal level, was immense. Not only did these lies permanently tarnish my name, lose me a significant portion of my income, and force me to go to police preemptively out of fear of the violence they might choose to inflict on me if I didn't, but the target that was painted on my back led to so much harassment and abuse that I've had to receive therapy for what Oates chose to inflict upon me. Violence she turned to whilst fully cognizant of what the consequences of her actions would likely be, as can be seen in her video the week before. And who was there to help Oates sell this lie? None other than Rose of Dawn.
Long story short, the exchanges get quite heated, and Rachel makes it clear that this is impacting her mental health.
But Essence of Thought doesn't care about that, because he just saw something that Thomas did months ago that he didn't like and was like, let's end his career now. Because he doesn't like any of us, because he's a doo-doo head. Oh. Everyone's picking up on doo-doo head. So, next thing you know, Essence of Thought is going to be making another video on me, and it's going to be Rachel Oates exposed, and he's going to be like, look, she called me a doo-doo head. He's going to get really mad.
Essence of Thought decides to ignore this and continues lashing out at her. Eventually, this came to a head last week when, in a rather distressing video, Rachel showed the true extent of this harassment and what it had done to her mental health. In the video, she'd clearly self-harmed, and it was obvious that she was going through a very tough time. Now, this was then brought to the attention of Essence of Thought. Now, one would think that, especially seeing the kind of steps that Rachel had taken,
she called on her 100,000 subscribers to circumvent my block of her, mentioning said block in her post, effectively ordering them to abuse me into apologizing to her for having ever pointed out her history of transphobia, using the excuse about a tweet sent to someone else whilst I had her blocked as justification.
You would use this time to at least back off, kind of chill, let things rest. Unfortunately, Essence of Thought decided not to do that and accused Rachel of trying to shut down trans people again by harming herself. Now, I find this very strange because as I'm sure a lot of people have seen in these woke circles, so to speak, they like to act that mental health is something which should be taken very seriously. And then you have some of the really bizarre takes that came from the trans community as a result of all this. You had mermaids pointing out that you have to do this, otherwise plenty of trans kids are going to kill themselves, which, is really like an abuser. That's an abuser's narrative there.
It's disgusting behaviour. My point is, you never, ever, ever try and control someone's behaviour by threatening violence against them or yourself. It is not okay, and it is never, ever acceptable. It is not okay, and it is never, ever acceptable. It is not okay, and it is never, ever acceptable. This is something I feel really, really strongly about.
Because according to her, pointing out the facts that transphobia and the denial of life-saving medical care leads to high rates of suicide in the trans community and thus they shouldn't do that is an abuser's narrative. Yet Rachel Oates actually weaponizing self-harm to silence people she spent the last several months harassing isn't. Try to get that to make sense. Of course, it doesn't. Oates and Dawn have inverted reality to match their warped ideology. That's why it's no coincidence that Lily Cade made the same argument as a serial rapist trying to build her career on presenting trans women as inherently predatory. This sort of inverted mislogic defines the transphobic movement. It's what unites them. Speaking of, Oates and Dawn became very close friends following Oates' weaponization of self-harm. And it's easy to see why. Dawn offers Oates plausible deniability, at least in the minds of cis people, when it comes to her history of transphobia. Meanwhile, Oates offers Dawn a way to grow her audience, Oates being much larger than Dawn. That's why Rachel Oates would go on to promote Dawn in her February 2020 video, 5 Women You Should Be Watching on YouTube. By the way, in case you're one of the people getting ready to comment with the claim that Oates didn't know about Dawn's transphobia, both towards non-binary and binary trans people, a claim she'd gone to make when she was called out for said video, that's simply not true. Oates had been warned all the way back in December of 2019, months prior to her promotion of Dawn. She just saw Dawn's name as a token trans person to be more alluring than the potential risk of being called out. She also framed support for the human rights of non-binary folk to be optional in the same comment, an act which, in itself, is incredibly transphobic. And it's important to note that I'm not the only person to suffer as a result of both Oates and Dawn's actions. So too has the trans community at large. Because as much as some people might like you to ignore reality, the ongoing situation in places like Texas, Idaho, and Florida regarding trans youth and LGBT+ rights in general was launched by the discourse regarding transphobia in sports. We beat the bathroom scare as a community. We thought we'd won, only for transphobia in sports to blow up. First across the internet with the help of people like Rationality Rules, and then across the US in bills like those seen in Florida and Idaho that require students to submit themselves to be sexually assaulted in order to prove that they were cis. That in turn paved the way for the genocidal bills we are now seeing regarding trans youth, making both Dawn and Oates culpable. Because if Rachel Oates' attempts to weaponize her self-harm to silence critics of her and her friends' transphobia had failed, things would have likely turned out very differently in the sector community. We could have dealt with our transphobia problem, not only preventing us from adding to the issue, but actually leaving us free to stand up and support the trans community en masse, as we did gay and bisexual folk. We could have had places like the ACA actually doing something on the ground. Would it have fixed everything? Probably not. Would it have made things significantly better for the trans community to have said support? Absolutely. But instead, Rachel Oates saw to it that said discussion was cut short, an act of violence Rosa Dawn was all too happy to help her with. The entire trans community was made to suffer, because Oates couldn't handle criticism of her abusive behaviour and thus weaponized self-harm as an abuser actually does, and Dawn profiteered on that. And no, I will not be silenced regarding that fact. So I hope you can appreciate this demonstration of Rosa Dawn's hypocrisy, both in her defense of Rapist and her support for people weaponizing self-harm to silence critics. I feel like it's important to document stuff like this since it really does undermine a lot of Dawn's bigoted arguments, making it clear that she's an opportunist who will say whatever she can to make it appear like she has a point. It's also been somewhat cathartic to lay out Dawn's connection to Rachel Oates and how Dawn helped Oates whitewash her transphobia. And if you appreciate what we do here and want to help out, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make all this possible. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Hannah Banghart, Gert Van Vorst, Sosh Daniels, Cthulhu, Higgins the Seagull, and Flynn. And for myself, Ladita and Levi, take care now.